Most financial advice sounds simple until real life gets involved. Spend less, save more, avoid debt, be disciplined, track everything. And on paper, a lot of that sounds reasonable. The problem is not always that the advice is wrong. The problem is that advice is often given as if people live inside perfect conditions. Calm schedules, stable income, unlimited energy, no emergencies, no stress, no emotional pressure, no systems constantly competing for attention, money, and behavior. But real financial life does not work that cleanly. People make decisions while tired, while overwhelmed, while behind, while trying to hold together complicated lives. And when advice ignores that reality, even good advice can start feeling impossible. Not because people are incapable, because the advice is often incomplete, and incomplete advice creates frustration. Then frustration turns into shame, and shame makes people believe they failed, when sometimes the advice never explained the full system in the first place. This is Streetwise Wealth Academy. I'm Winston, your synthetic financial educator. This content is educational commentary only and is not personalized financial advice, so always research financial decisions carefully. One of the biggest reasons financial advice fails is because information alone does not automatically change behavior. Most people already know certain things. They know saving money matters. They know debt can create pressure. They know budgeting can help organize spending. They know financial decisions have consequences. But knowing something and consistently living it are very different things. That distinction matters enormously. Because money is not only mathematical, money is emotional, behavioral, environmental, psychological, and repetitive. Advice often talks to the mathematical side, but real life usually happens inside the behavioral side. That is where many people get stuck. Not because they do not understand the sentence, because the sentence does not fully match the environment they are living inside. Another reason financial advice fails is because it often assumes everybody starts from the same place. But people do not start from the same place. Income differs. Family responsibilities differ. Debt obligations differ. Housing costs differ. Transportation needs differ. Stress levels differ. Health situations differ. Local cost of living differs. So advice that sounds easy in one situation may feel almost impossible in another. That does not automatically mean the person is weak. It means context matters. And generic advice often removes context. That creates a serious problem. Because when advice sounds simple but does not fit real life, people often blame themselves. They think, I must be undisciplined. I must be bad with money. I must be behind. But sometimes the issue is not personal failure. Sometimes the issue is advice that ignores the structure surrounding the person. Now timing matters too. A piece of advice can be logical and still be difficult to apply at the wrong time. For example, save more money sounds reasonable. But if someone's income is already committed before it arrives, saving may not be a motivation problem. It may be a structure problem. The paycheck arrives. Bills are waiting. Payments are waiting. Groceries are waiting. Gas is waiting. Life is waiting. And whatever remains often gets absorbed by normal pressure, not luxury, not recklessness. Normal pressure. That is why advice can feel frustrating. It gives the conclusion, without explaining the system competing against that conclusion. Another reason financial advice fails is emotional exhaustion. Exhausted people do not behave like spreadsheets. A long day changes decisions. Stress changes decisions. Burnout changes decisions. Uncertainty changes decisions. And when people are drained, convenience becomes more attractive. Fast food, delivery, entertainment, impulse purchases, small rewards. Not because people are weak, because overloaded minds naturally seek relief. That is normal psychology. But a lot of financial advice ignores emotional reality. It speaks as if decisions are made in calm silence, but many financial decisions are made after work, after stress, after frustration, after a day that already used up most of the person's energy. That matters, because advice that requires perfect emotional control often collapses when real emotional pressure appears. Another reason advice fails is because it focuses on isolated actions instead of repeated systems. One budget, one app, one spreadsheet, one motivational reset. Those things can help for a while, but long-term financial outcomes are usually shaped by repeated systems, recurring obligations, recurring habits, recurring stress patterns, recurring convenience behaviors, recurring emotional decisions. If the repeated system does not change, the advice usually fades. That is why so many people start strong, then slowly drift back into familiar patterns. The plan did not necessarily become useless. The surrounding system remained stronger. That is an important distinction, because most people do not lose progress all at once. They lose it gradually. One exception, one tired decision, one unexpected bill, one convenience purchase, one missed review, then the old pattern returns, not dramatically, quietly. Another reason advice fails is shame. A lot of financial advice carries quiet judgment. Just stop spending. Just budget better. Just be disciplined. Just cook at home. Just cancel everything. The words may sound practical, but the emotional tone often creates shame, and shame rarely creates clarity. Usually, shame creates avoidance. People stop looking closely. They stop checking accounts. They stop tracking patterns. They stop asking questions. They begin seeing themselves as the problem. And once identity becomes tangled with financial stress, behavior becomes harder to evaluate calmly. That is why shame-based education is dangerous. It may create short-term intensity, but it rarely creates long-term understanding. And understanding is what people actually need, not humiliation, not panic, not guilt. Understanding. Modern financial systems also make advice harder to follow. Spending is easy. Borrowing can feel easy. Subscribing is easy. Renewing is automatic. Upgrading feels normal. But slowing down often requires effort. Canceling requires effort. Reviewing requires effort. Questioning requires effort. That structure matters, because advice often tells people to resist systems, without explaining how powerful those systems are. Human beings naturally adapt to low-friction environments. That is not weakness. That is psychology. If one behavior is easy, and the opposite behavior requires constant effort, the easy behavior usually repeats more often. That is how environments shape outcomes. Another reason financial advice fails is lifestyle normalization. A convenience becomes routine. An upgrade becomes expected. A payment becomes background noise. A subscription becomes invisible. A lifestyle becomes identity, and once something becomes normal, changing it becomes emotionally uncomfortable. People are not only changing numbers, they are changing comfort, routine, expectation, identity. That is much harder than adjusting a spreadsheet. This is why advice that sounds simple can feel emotionally difficult. The person is not just cutting a cost. They may be challenging a version of normal they have already adapted to. That is not impossible, but it is more complex than most advice admits. Another problem is the overfocus on discipline. Discipline matters, but discipline is not unlimited. Willpower changes with sleep, stress, environment, pressure, emotional bandwidth. A system that requires someone to fight their environment every single day is usually fragile. Not because the person is weak, because constant resistance is difficult to sustain. Better understanding begins when people see the environment clearly, because then the problem stops looking like a character flaw. It starts looking like a system, and systems can be examined. Attention is another hidden factor. Modern life fragments attention constantly. Notifications, algorithms, advertisements, bills, emails, work pressure, family responsibilities, and fragmented attention makes reflection harder. That matters because financial clarity usually requires pause, review, perspective, stillness. But many people live in environments where reflection is constantly interrupted. So advice that requires calm attention may fail, not because it is wrong, but because the environment makes calm attention difficult to maintain. That is a major gap in financial education. People are told to make better decisions, but they are rarely taught how attention itself shapes decision-making. Another reason advice fails is that money is connected to more than money. Money connects to housing, work, family, health, transportation, time, stress, relationships, identity. So when advice ignores that complexity, it can feel disconnected from real life. The person hears the advice, they understand the logic, they may even agree with it, but they still cannot apply it consistently. That gap creates frustration. And frustration often gets misread as failure. But sometimes the problem is not that the person rejected the advice. Sometimes the advice was too narrow for the reality it was supposed to address. Modern financial systems also contain incentives. Companies want recurring payments. Platforms want attention. Advertisers want emotional engagement. Lenders want participation. Subscription systems want continuity. Again, this is not about conspiracy, it is about incentives. Systems naturally evolve toward repeatable behavior, because repeatable behavior reduces uncertainty. Financial advice often fails when it ignores those incentives. Because people are not making choices in empty space, they are making choices inside systems designed to influence behavior. That changes the conversation completely. The issue is not only, what should someone do? The deeper question is, what environment is shaping what they repeatedly do? That question matters, because repeated behavior usually matters more than isolated intention. Now, this does not mean people are powerless. Far from it. The point is accuracy. If the problem is behavioral, the explanation should include behavior. If the problem is structural, the explanation should include structure. If the problem is environmental, the explanation should include environment. Otherwise, the advice may sound clean, but fail in practice. And when advice fails repeatedly, people begin believing something is wrong with them. That is why deeper financial education matters, because it gives people language for what they are experiencing, not as excuses, as understanding. Another reason advice fails is because it gives answers before helping people see patterns. But pattern recognition matters. Why does the budget collapse? Why does savings disappear? Why does stress return? Why does convenient spending keep coming back? Why does debt feel manageable at first, then heavy later? Without seeing the pattern, advice feels like isolated instruction, and isolated instruction is easy to forget. But once the pattern becomes visible, the advice begins making more sense, because the person understands what the advice is responding to. That is the difference between being told what to do and understanding what is happening. One creates pressure, the other creates clarity, and clarity usually lasts longer than pressure. If you step back and observe the broader system, something becomes clear. Financial advice often fails when it is too narrow. It focuses on the action, but ignores the environment. It focuses on numbers, but ignores behavior. It focuses on discipline, but ignores exhaustion. It focuses on choices, but ignores systems. And when advice ignores the forces shaping behavior, people are left feeling like they failed advice that was never complete enough to begin with. That is why financial education has to go deeper than tips. Tips can be useful, but tips are not the same as understanding. Understanding creates context. Context creates awareness. Awareness changes observation. And better observation changes how people interpret their own behavior. Not with shame, with clarity. Now, financial life is rarely shaped by one dramatic decision. It is usually shaped by repeated systems operating quietly across time. Small habits, small obligations, small emotional decisions, small environmental pressures, small patterns accumulating gradually underneath awareness. And once those systems become visible, financial advice starts looking different. Not as magic, not as judgment, not as one-size-fits-all instruction, but as information that only becomes useful when the surrounding system is understood clearly. That is the missing piece. Advice works best when people understand the system it belongs inside, and when they do not, even good advice can feel impossible to apply. That concludes today's lesson. Peace. If this lesson helped you see money a little differently, then stay with the series, because financial understanding is not built from one idea. It is built layer by layer, one system, one pattern, one hidden behavior at a time. This first month is focused on the financial lessons many adults were never properly taught growing up. How money moves, how debt works, how stress builds, how behavior gets shaped, and how modern financial systems quietly influence everyday life. So watch the next lesson when you're ready, and keep building the foundation. This is Streetwise Wealth Academy. I'm Winston. Peace.